So as I was saying, tonight we're focusing on assisted suicide, but let's start with a discussion of suicide in general, especially some history. And I was saying that throughout history, suicide has evoked a very wide range of reactions. You may well have experienced those yourselves. Some bafflement, dismissal, sometimes heroic glorification, sympathy, anger, moral, religious condemnation, a whole wide range of emotions related to suicide. And that's what makes it a controversial issue. And it's always been controversial to some degree. So if we go back to ancient Greece and we look at the philosopher Plato, he was generally opposed to suicide. He saw it as basically a form of cowardice, but he did make exceptions. There were two basic exceptions when he thought suicide was okay. One, when one's mind is corrupted and one's character cannot be salvaged because of what one's mind has caused them to do. See, a lot of these, there's this notion of the heroic side of things. Secondly, when self-killing resulted from shame at having participated in grossly unjust actions. So if you had been involved in a and who or what determines what's grossly unjust? Your culture, your society. Shame. If you had shame, then you could legitimately commit suicide. His student Aristotle has an interesting approach. He discusses suicide in relationship to a general discussion of justice. And it occurs in the middle of his Nicomachean Ethics, which is one of his great books. He concludes that self-killing is not individually unjust, as long as it's voluntary, not influenced by another, because no harm is done to oneself because it's consensual, so it can't be unjust. But he does say it's an injustice to the community. It's an injustice to the community because of the harm done to others. So that's interesting. He focuses on he condemns it, not because of what you do to yourself, but what happens when you do in terms of the community. In Rome, suicide was never a legal offense, but it was more a pragmatic question and a question of, I want to say moral, but sort of just a tradition. It wasn't illegal. It was forbidden, although not illegal. And it could be, see how something can be forbidden but not be illegal? It's forbidden because of some sort of moral code that you hold or your community holds. 3 cases when it was morally forbidden. Those accused of capital crimes. So if you've been accused of murder, you couldn't kill yourself. I'll get to this in a moment. Slaves could not kill themselves, and soldiers could not kill themselves. A regular fighting soldier. The reason behind the first 2 was primarily economic. If the accused killed himself prior to trial and conviction, then the state lost the right to seize his property. We're going to come across the notion that suicide will be illegal, and people say, well, how can it be illegal? How can you punish someone who's dead? Well, there are other ways. For one thing, their property. So that was one case. If a slave killed himself within 6 months of purchase, the master could not claim a refund. And a soldier committing suicide was considered the same as desertion. There will be exceptions. But if you're in battle and you commit suicide out of fear, then it's generally considered desertion. So they had sort of this, there was nothing illegal about it, but that was sort of the standard. They did, however, approve of what might be termed patriotic suicide. That is, death as an alternative to dishonor. Death as an alternative to dishonor. So we find Cato the Younger, who killed himself after the Battle of Thespis in 46 BCE, when he was defeated by the forces of Julius Caesar, committed suicide, and this was considered a virtuous death. It was guided by reason and conscience. It was a patriotic suicide. He killed himself for the Republic. Now, the whole notion of suicide it has some fuzzy areas about it. When we think of suicide generally, don't we think of just someone taking their life overtly? But what about if you put yourself in a situation where you're going to die and know it? Is that a form of suicide? And this is where it gets a little fuzzy. Now, there was a school of philosophers in Rome known as the Stoics. I don't know if you ever heard of Stoicism. And they thought that suicide was a legitimate escape from, quote, an unbearable reality that had nothing left to give. And it was a type of guarantee of personal freedom. This was a philosophical position. Its greatest spokesperson was a philosopher by the name of Seneca, who was actually one of Nero's sidekicks and actually killed himself. But anyway, this is what he had to say. You may consider that the same thing happens to us. Life has carried some men with the greatest rapidity to the harbor. That's death. The harbor they were bound to reach, even if they tarried on the way, while others it has fretted and harassed. In other words, some people go through life fairly easily, they reach death. Others have great difficulties along the way, those that are fretted and harassed. To such a life, as you are aware, one should not always cling. For mere living is not a good, but living well. That was the Stoic notion. Just to stay alive, just to be alive, that's not important. To live well. Accordingly, the wise man will live as long as he ought, not as long as he can. He will mark in what place, with whom, and how he is to conduct his existence and what he is about to do. He always reflects concerning the quality and not the quantity of his life. It is not a question of dying earlier or later, but of dying well or ill. And dying well means escape from the danger of living ill. This is the classic Stoic argument for suicide. There are times when life is not worth living. Now, this will become a question in the whole assisted suicide issue. Is it a matter of living as long as you can and doing everything you can to keep it as long as it could possibly be? Or is there a point where living well is what matters, and at that point you would like to say adios? Okay. So that's the classic Stoic position. But he drew a line. Just any suicide wasn't okay. Especially suicide based on passion or love. For example, Mark Antony, suicide after, with Cleopatra, the Mark Antony suicide. This was not considered a proper suicide by the Stoics. Indeed, many Roman philosophers considered romantic or passionate love a type of mental illness, which could drive people to do things that they wouldn't normally do rationally. I think you can ask an ex-president, you can ask about something like that, right? Bill Clinton, I mean, what the most irrational act you could think of? But the Stoics saw this. Passion takes us over. So when you kill yourself out of passion and love, that's not an honorable suicide from the point of view of the Stoics. So in the Middle Ages, suicide was considered a mortal sin. You would go to hell. As a result, the church excommunicated people who attempted suicide. You'd be excommunicated if you tried and failed. And those who died were buried outside consecrated graveyards. A suicide could not be buried in a consecrated church graveyard. There was a criminal ordinance by Louis XIV of France in 1670. It was extremely severe in its punishment. The dead person, the suicide's body, was drawn through the streets, face down, then hung or thrown on a garbage heap. All of the person's property was confiscated. So you say, you can't do anything to the person who has committed suicide. Well, there were consequences for the body. You couldn't be buried. You were a threat of going to hell, and your property would be taken. Attitudes began to change, as most attitudes towards many things during the Renaissance. How many of you heard of Thomas More? He was an English humanist. He wrote his famous classic work, Utopia. This was his utopian society, his ideal society. That was written in 1516. In it, he said that a person afflicted with disease can free himself from this bitter life, since by death he will put an end not to enjoyment, but to torture. It will be a pious and holy action in his utopia. So this is this question of, which we'll confront when we look at assisted suicide. A person who is in deep and constant pain. However, killing oneself for other reasons was still a crime for his utopia and was punished by the denial of funeral rites. So what More is saying is it's okay if you're in extreme pain. Why would you want to keep somebody alive in extreme pain? And remember, this was in the 16th century. Anesthetics, pain was you bit on a rag or alcohol or something, but you couldn't just take painkillers. Then there was John Donne. How many have heard of the famous poet, the metaphysical poet, John Donne? He wrote an entire defense of suicide. It's known as the Euthanatos. And he actually brought proof from biblical figures. He believed that suicide was acceptable under certain conditions. He said you even find it in the Bible. And he said Samson was one example, and Saul, King Saul. You may recall, how many know the story of Samson? Samson and Delilah, and the Philistines sort of get her to try and get him to surrender, etc. But, she wants to know what his secret is, and he goes through everything. And then finally he tells about cutting the hair. And once his captors get him, he leans up against the temple and then pulls them down, killing others, but also killing himself. Is that suicide? And then when we get to Saul, in 1 Samuel, that's King Saul, the first king of the united Israel. He's fleeing from the enemy, and then he asks his bodyguard to kill him. He won't, so he takes his own life by falling on his sword. Okay, so John Donne says even in the Bible you find certain situations where there is suicide. But he goes a little further. And some have suggested Dunn was a rather melancholy person himself. And you always have to, whenever you're reading somebody's view of something, sometimes it's good to know a little bit about their own personal biography. So he argues that suicide is not a natural, so natural a sin that it can never be otherwise. In other words, there are times when suicide is not a sin. And he uses this whole essay to argue it. He said, but most cases of suicide, despair, self-protection, fear of suffering, he thinks those are sinful. But he argues it's justified when, like submission to martyrdom, is submission to martyrdom the same as suicide? In other words, you know that you are going to be martyred if you do something. So you know you are going to die. Is that a form of suicide? He thought that it was a form of suicide, but it was a legitimate form of suicide. He even goes so far, and this got him some real criticism, that Christ himself, who allowed himself to be crucified voluntarily, was in fact a suicide. Depends on your definition, doesn't it? Depends on your definition. Okay. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, people started to find loopholes. To find loopholes for the sole purpose of not going to hell. How can you, quote unquote, commit suicide and not go to hell? Now, this is a rather bizarre example. But there was a woman by the name of Christina Johansdotter. She died in 1740. She was a Swedish murderer. Why did she commit the murder? So she could be executed. That's not suicide. Now that's kind of bizarre, but it's amazing how people will try to find loopholes for things. Chris's dad used to tell me this joke. He said, Moses came down from the mountain with 10 commandments, and an hour later the lawyers had figured out 1,000 exceptions. Anyway, so then we come to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century, is when we really start about the term secularization. And it's during this time that attitudes really begin to shift regarding suicide. There was a philosopher, David Hume, famous philosopher. He denied suicide was a crime. Remember, up until this point, it's a crime. And he said it's not a crime, as it affected no one and was potentially an advantage to the individual. Why should it be a crime? He said. If you're just a reasonable person, why would that be a crime? In his 1777 Essays on Suicide and the Immortality of the Soul, which you're all going to go home and read, he rhetorically asked, quote, why should I prolong a miserable existence because of some frivolous advantage which the public may perhaps receive from me? Why? Why should I do this? You also see a shift in opinion in the Times of London in 1786 had an open debate, and the question was, is suicide an act of courage? Now, the very fact that a newspaper would publish that as a question shows that people are starting to maybe rethink this whole question of suicide. And by the 19th century, much of Europe, the act of suicide had shifted from being viewed as caused by sin as being called by mental instability. This is when it becomes a medical issue rather than a moral theological issue. Although it remained illegal for most of this period, it increasingly became the target of satire. For example, in 1839, Bentley's Miscellany, that was a publication in London, there was an ad for a London suicide company. And in Gilbert and Sullivan, have you seen The Mikado? Yeah. Satirized the idea of executing someone who had already killed themselves. So it's becoming a little more playful in society. In 1879, English law began to distinguish between suicide and homicide. Although suicide was still, you had to forfeit your estate. But you see, before that, suicide and homicide are the same thing. It's just that the homicide is towards yourself. Now, by the end of the 19th century, starting to distinguish legally. There's a difference between homicide and suicide. Okay, if we turn to the United States, historically in the United States, various states listed the act of suicide as a felony. But in general, these policies were not enforced that much. And by the late 1960s, 18 U.S. states had no laws against suicide. By the late 1980s, 30 of the 50 states had no laws against suicide. How many today have laws against suicide? 0. There's no law in the United States against suicide. And okay, you said, well, again, what would the law against suicide be? It was generally a property law. That if you committed suicide, there were certain financial things that could not be done as opposed to if you just died normally. But that's not the case now. So I want to turn to assisted suicide, but I also need to mention another form of suicide, which has generally been accepted across the board, and that's military suicide. And I don't mean just an individual soldier, but in certain cases. Example, who's heard of Masada? Masada was if you've ever been to Israel and you go down the Dead Sea, that was the fortress where the Jews, a number of Jews hid from the Romans. And the Romans sieged that for a long period of time. If you've ever been there, you just wonder how the Romans actually did that. They had to build these big ramps to get up there. But in the end, all of the Jews committed suicide. And that was considered legitimate. During World War II, who's heard of the kamikaze? The kamikaze were the divine wind, the kami of the divine wind. Was that a suicide? We called it suicide bombers. That was considered honorable. Even if you go to Tokyo today, the Great War Shrine there's a whole section just for those young kamikaze pilots. And it's really moving to read some of their poetry, because a lot of them would write letters before they took off, either to their parents or poems. And they were heroes. And that probably came, in Japanese tradition, there was seppuku, the cutting, or what we call harikiri, cutting of the stomach by the samurai. Why was that done? Usually, if you had failed to honor your lord or lost a battle, it was shameful to survive. It was shameful to survive. So that sort of military suicide has been broadly accepted. Again, some people say, well, is that suicide? Well, if you're taking your own life, what if it's for a cause? Yeah, you might want to distinguish. Okay, so let's turn to, although one, of course, and then there are the Muslim suicide bombers. Yeah. They see themselves in a similar role. Okay, let's now turn to assisted suicide. Also known as dying or medical aid in dying, it's suicide undertaken, and this is important, with the aid of another person. If you kill yourself, that's suicide. That's not illegal. But if you ask someone else to assist you in that process, that's what we're going to be discussing, because that's still illegal in most states. Right? And that's become the big question. Which you may say, well, what's the difference? You know, and this is what's going to be done. What's the difference if I say, I'm going to take my own life, or could you help me because I'm incapacitated? That becomes the question. It's usually referred to as physician-assisted suicide. You'll see it as PAS. And that's suicide assisted by a physician or other healthcare provider. It's sometimes considered a form, you've probably heard this, euthanasia, or the act of ending what is considered to be an undesirable life. Not to be confused with eugenics. How many of you have heard of the term eugenics? Eugenics is a decision made by a culture or a society that a certain group of people, for whatever reason, often handicapped, etc., do not deserve to live. Okay. This was, the Nazis did this, but there was a big eugenics movement in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, documentation has shown that Hitler got a lot of his ideas from the US eugenics movement. It was backed by something called social Darwinism. Only the strong survive, or going a step further, only the strong deserve to survive. And the argument was made, if you keep weak members in your pool, your genetic pool, what are you going to be doing to that genetic pool over time? Weakening it. That was the eugenics argument. That's not euthanasia. Euthanasia is just voluntarily taking life with assistance. Okay, in terms of U.S. history, in early 1894, the politician and orator Robert Ingersoll, I don't know if you ever read of any Robert Ingersoll stuff, he was great. He argued for self-determined euthanasia. So this is as far back as 1894. He stated that when someone is suffering from a terminal illness, such as terminal cancer, they should have a right to end their pain through suicide. He was arguing this in 1894. He stated that where someone is suffering from this illness, it's a moral obligation. See, he was using a moral argument for, not just a rights argument. See, you can argue that you're right, but he was saying it's a moral argument to allow someone to, because keeping them in pain is immoral. Then in 1891, Felix Adler, he was founder of the ethical culture movement. He argued those suffering from overwhelming pain should have the right to commit suicide, and furthermore, it should be permissible for a doctor to assist. This is 1891. Both men argued against prior moral objections, and consequently, their position actually began to have a social impact. The first attempt to legalize euthanasia in the United States took place in 1906, when Henry Hunt, known as the boy mayor of Cincinnati, introduced legislation into the General Assembly of Ohio. So the first attempt to actually make it legal goes all the way back to 1906. He did so at the behest of one Anna Sophina Hall, who was a wealthy heiress, and she supplied the money. Major figure in the euthanasia movement. What was her motive? She had watched her mother die after an extended battle with liver cancer. and had dedicated herself to ensuring that others would not have to endure that kind of suffering. She became engaged in an extensive letter writing campaign, and in 1905, she helped found the American Humane Association. It was the first significant public debate on the topic in the 20th century. They would have debates, public debates. Hunt's bill called for the administration of an anesthetic to bring about a patient's death. This was written into the bill. So long as the person was of lawful age and sound mind. So there were restrictions. And they were suffering from a fatal and irrevocable illness, or were in great physical pain. It also required that the case be heard by a physician, informed consent in front of 3 witnesses, attendance of 3 physicians who had to agree the patient's recovery was impossible. A motion to reject the bill outright was voted down, but the bill failed to pass 79 to 23. So it failed. So as far back as the beginning of the century, legislation or attempts at legislation were being introduced. Another bill in 1906, a little more comprehensive, was introduced by Assemblyman Ross Gregory in the Iowa legislature. It engendered, again, considerable debate, but failed to pass. So although these early attempts did not succeed, the Euthanasia Society of America, founded in New York in 1938 by a Reverend Charles Potter, continued to promote the cause. And by 1947, a reported 37% of people favored physician-assisted suicide. That was in 1947. On January 6, 1949, the Society presented to the New York State Legislature a petition to legalize euthanasia, signed by 379 Protestant and Jewish ministers, the largest group of religious leaders ever to have taken this stance. However, the petition did not result in any legal changes. So what we find going on is legislation being introduced, arguments being made, but nothing being done legally. So 2 individuals who became centerpieces in the assisted suicide debate were Jack Kevorkian, you may have heard of Jack, and Nancy Cruzon. You might not have heard of Nancy, but I'll have. Jack Kevorkian was an American pathologist and euthanasia proponent. In fact, if you would, in modern times, if you say who's been the major proponent of euthanasia, it was Jack Kevorkian. He publicly championed a terminal patient's right to die by physician-assisted suicide, embodied in his quote, "Dying is not a crime." In 1987, he started advertising in Detroit newspapers as a physician consultant for death counseling. His first public assisted suicide was a 54-year-old woman by the name of Janet Adkins, who had been diagnosed in 1989 with Alzheimer's disease, and that assisted suicide took place in 1990. Charges of murder were dropped on December 13th, as there were at that time no laws in Michigan regarding assisted suicide. However, in 1991, Michigan revoked his medical license and made it clear that he was no longer permitted to practice medicine or to work with patients. Did that stop him? No. By the mid-1990s, he had claimed that he had assisted at least 130 patients. In 1998, he was arrested and tried for his direct role in a case of voluntary euthanasia on a man named Thomas Youk, Y-O-U-K, who suffered from Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. Kevorkian was convicted of second-degree murder and served 8 years in prison. He was released on parole in June of 2007 on condition he would not offer advice, participate in, or be present at the act of any type of suicide involving euthanasia. Neither could he promote nor talk about it publicly. That were the conditions of his parole. So what about Nancy Cruzon? January 11th, 1983. She was 25 years old. She lost control of her car while driving at night near Carthage, Missouri. She was thrown from the vehicle, landed face down in a water-filled ditch. Paramedics found her with no vital signs, but they were able to resuscitate her. After 3 weeks in a coma, she was diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state. Surgeons inserted a feeding tube for her long-term care. 5 years later, Cruzon's parents asked the doctors to remove the feeding tube. The hospital refused to do so without a court order, since removal of the tube would cause her death. The Cruzons filed for and received a court order for the feeding tube to be removed. The trial court ruled that constitutionally there is, quote, a fundamental natural right to refuse or direct the withholding or withdrawal of artificial life-prolonging procedures where the person no longer has cognitive brain function and there is no hope for recovery. So that's what the lower court ruled. Well, you know how our court system works. That court ruled that Nancy had effectively directed the withdrawal of life support by telling a friend earlier that if she were sick or injured, she would not wish to continue her life unless she could live at least halfway normally. So it was based on the fact that a witness came and said, this is what she told me. The state of Missouri appealed the decision. In a 4-3 decision, the Supreme Court of Missouri reversed the trial court's decision. It ruled that no one may refuse treatment for another person absent an adequate living will, that's why you should all get done, or clear, convincing, and reliable evidence, which they said was not present in this case. The Cruzons appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1989. The year before, the court had upheld 2 state laws in Washington and New York that absolutely prohibited assisted suicide. But as the Cruzon case was tangential to the assisted suicide issue, they agreed to take the case. Okay? See, it's tangential. We're getting a fine line here. This isn't necessarily what we would call Kevorkian assisted. It's Now, do you have the right to have something removed that's artificial? So these, they blend into. In a 5-4 decision, the court found in favor of the Missouri Department of Health. It could not be removed. And ruled that nothing in the Constitution prevented the state of Missouri from requiring clear and convincing evidence before terminating life support. The decision's made, the Cruzons haven't given up. They gathered additional evidence that Nancy would have wanted her life support terminated. So they go to court again. At this point, the state of Missouri withdraws from the case. They say, we've made our point. Then a Jasper County probate judge ruled the Cruzons had met the evidentiary burden of clear and convincing evidence. They went and got more evidence, in other words, that support. See, what's at question here is, if I tell someone I give them the right to do certain things for me, I need to have that pretty solid. It better be not just someone said so. It has to be in writing. It should probably be notarized. And that's why we have today these documents that if any of you, what's the tech? Yeah. So this is before that. This is why these directives came about, because of this case. Okay. So he ordered a court order to remove the feeding tube, which was done, and she died on December 26th, 1990. So that was what, 7 years? 7 years. Right to Life activists, an organization, filed seven separate petitions with the court asking them to resume feeding. But they were found to have no legal standing for intervention. At her funeral, her father told reporters, "I would prefer to have my daughter back and let someone else be this trailblazer." 6 years later, he killed himself. Okay, in 2006, the Supreme Court decided that the states were free to both legalize and regulate the act of assisted suicide. So, as a result, PAS is now legal in 9 states and DC. The 9 states: California, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. Now, they all have requirements that some are pretty strict about who makes. You just can't get someone to come in and now kill you. You have to have psychiatrists, you have to have medical agreement, you have to have all sorts of things established. Internationally, what are the countries? Switzerland. In fact, before these times, some people went to Switzerland to actually, or the Netherlands, to have this done. Spain, Belgium, Canada fairly recently, and certain states in Australia, Victoria being one. Again, there are stipulations around these, and if you want to look them up, but in these states and in these countries, it's no longer illegal to have PAS. So what about in terms of religion? Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy oppose PAS, seeing it as interference with God's plan for the soul. Within both traditions, however, many approve of what is sometimes called passive euthanasia, or the ceasing of all but palliative treatment for a dying patient. In other words, tubes and things like this, which is different than someone in pain getting assisted suicide. Palliative care aims at optimizing the quality of life and mitigating suffering with people with serious and complex illnesses. For example, they're involved in pain management, aids to depression, helping with sleep. So trying to, the sort of thing that hospice would do. Most Protestant denominations recommend palliative care and the termination, quote, extraordinary treatment. That's a little bit, but generally what that means is keeping someone alive with a tube or some sort of medical device that keeps them breathing, or so. But nearly all of them stop short of supporting active PAS, most Protestant groups. The exceptions are the Unitarian Universalists and the more liberal portions of the United Church of Christ. They favor PAS. What's the position of the United Methodist Church? We believe that suicide is not the way a human life should end. If death is deliberately sought as the means to relieve suffering, that must be understood as direct and intentional taking of life. The United Methodist tradition opposes the taking of life as an offense against God's sole dominion over life and abandonment of hope and humility before God. Yet, even as we oppose the deliberate ending of life, we continue to affirm that nothing, including suicide, separates us from God's love and grace. Those whose pain and suffering compel them to commit suicide should not be condemned, nor should their surviving family and friends suffer from the stigma around suicide. So, it's officially against, but God's grace. And I think that, to me, that in terms of the power of Methodism, is that there's always that. There's nothing that can keep God's grace away. Okay? Suicide's not right, shouldn't do it, yet. There are a lot of yets and buts, aren't there? Which is that big tent. It's that big tent. Mm-hmm. Recent Orthodox conservative Reformed Jewish statements stress that both the hastening of death and unnecessarily prolonging of life are both wrong. That's from the Jewish position. Just played golf with Rabbi Mike today, and we were just in the middle of his putt. I asked him about assisted suicide. He missed the putt. But in any case, yeah, he said, even Reform, no to direct assisted suicide, but yes to palliative care. In fact, palliative care is not only encouraged, it's commanded. You have to take care of the death in terms of pain and suffering. And no extensive use of artificial things. All major Muslim legal schools are likewise opposed to PAS. They cite Quranic texts, and they interpret it as a form of murder. They also assert that suffering has a divine purpose. That's a traditional theological position, which, well, anyway. Most Buddhists and Hindus, because they believe in reincarnation, see that with reincarnation, a person's earthly life and suffering do not end with the death of the body. So if you're concerned about the end of suffering, well, you're just going to get rid of temporary suffering, but that will carry on into other lives. And so artificially, but during that period of time, you can develop good karma. So ironically, taking life early might in the long run, this is in a reincarnation scenario, be disadvantageous. Okay, so let's now look at the two arguments, pro and con. And we'll start with against suicide, or against assisted suicide. One of the most commonly presented ethical arguments against assisted suicide is referred to as the sanctity of human life. This comes from a religious position. In other words, human life is sacred, and any deliberate taking of a life is prohibited except in the defense of others. According to the Catholic Catechism, God is the creator and author of all life. Therefore, only God is the judge of when to end life. And we saw the UMC position. 2, many doctors support the most current version of the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics, which states that physician-assisted suicide is prohibited. It prohibits this because it is seen as fundamentally incompatible with a physician's role as a healer. And because it would be difficult or almost impossible to control, and would give serious risks. It's called the Hippocratic Oath. And so to assent to assisted suicide would be in violation, many doctors say, of the Hippocratic Oath that they take, which is to do no harm. 3, there's the argument called the slippery slope. This is an argument that's used in a lot of situations. It expresses the concern that if euthanasia, with patient permission, were legalized, it would not be long before involuntary euthanasia would start to appear. So it's once you allow this, then you'll get a little more, and pretty soon Johnny will say, you know, I think Dad, he might deserve to go now. You know, and it might be for legitimate reasons, but Dad hasn't agreed. So that's what they're saying. It could be a slippery slope. It's one of the primary arguments against it. Once you open up something, you're gonna have consequences you haven't looked at. Defenders of this concept say that legislation could never create a barrier that could separate these two. It's the nature of legislation. Legislation can always be taken and pretzeled. 4, there is a practical argument that legalizing PAS would give too much power to doctors. From this perspective, euthanasia gives doctors, not patients themselves, the ability to decide when patients should die. Because doctors provide the information to their patients on which their decisions will be made. Hence, no regulation of euthanasia laws could be strict enough to take this power away from doctors. How much do you trust your doctor? Here it is claimed that some studies have found that do not resuscitate orders are more frequently used for black people, alcohol misusers, non-English speakers, and people infected with HIV, suggesting that doctors have stereotypes about which is sometimes unconscious stereotypes about which lives are more or less valuable. See, they're saying this is getting close to eugenics. How are you going to separate the two? The slippery slope. And in the worst case scenario, opponents fear that doctors will kill burdensome patients without permission to spare health care costs. Yeah, Chris.
I thought do not necessitate was a commandment made by the patient or the person themselves.
Yeah, but if the doctor suggests, in a situation that you should have that, it's probably good for everyone to have that. I mean, I'm trying to stay neutral here. But what they're saying is, when I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I used to think doctors were close to God. I mean, they would come when anyone was sick, and people would get better. And so in the psyche, we sort of, now that's saying what we tend to do is we might give too much power to them. They're just people. Although they're trained, they have their prejudices, they have their conditions. So this is just the argument that's being used here. And you can judge whether it's a good or bad argument. Okay, so let's go to the other side. Arguments for assisted suicide. First, in religious terms, proponents argue that the role of religion should be to reduce suffering, not prolong it. It goes back to Ingersoll. This is a moral position that religion should take. The moral position is not only do no harm, do less suffering. Mm-hmm. Thus, to force a person to have to suffer a prolonged death is religiously inhumane. And in any case, a religious decision should be between an individual and his or her God, and not the state. Thus, according to the 1988 General Resolution of the Unitarian Universalists, I think I mentioned they support PAS. They advocate the right to self-determination in dying and the release from civil or criminal penalties of those who, under proper safeguards, act to honor the right of terminally ill patients to select the time of their own deaths. 2, one of the most well-known is that you have a constitutional right to die. It holds that the U.S. Constitution grants its citizen fundamental rights as an inherent part of liberty, which includes the right to die. The right to die is defined as the individual decision as to whether their person should be allowed to die when he or she could only continue to live in a diminished or enfeebled capacity or in great pain. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's how that argument is not a religious one, it's a constitutional one. 3, in medical terms, some argue that the Hippocratic Oath is outdated and no longer appropriate in a medical world that has witnessed tremendous technological change. Others assert that just as other parts of the oath have been adapted to meet modern standards, the phrase, "do no harm," is in dire need of reevaluation. What does it mean to do no harm? This position would say, if you're requiring someone to continue suffering, are you doing no harm? See, all of these issues, they're complex. They're complex. And it really takes a person with a fairly open mind to look at both sides as best you can and then make your own decision. Advocates for the legalization also contend that euthanasia in no way precludes doctors from providing the best palliative care to suffering patients. In fact, if anything, it enables them to demonstrate respect for the patient's autonomy. Administering euthanasia is not an easy option. In other words, they're saying, people, if you're asked that this isn't, it's not easy to make these decisions. People don't make them. It's a tough decision. And you got to give those people that the right to understand that. Because sometimes it's presented, oh, the doctor says, you got this, I'll help you die. You know, and Kevorkian sort of got that image of just sort of being fly by night. But this position is saying, no, this is a serious, difficult position to be in for a physician. They don't like it. They don't like it. Administering euthanasia is not an easy option. As Dr. Everett Lewin, professor of philosophy and medical ethics at the Free University in Amsterdam, puts it, there is no either or with respect to these options. Every appropriate palliative option available must be discussed with the patient and, if reasonable, tried before a request for assisted death can be accepted. In Oregon, for example, I know it's not easy to get a PAS. You've got to go through a lot of hoops. A lot of doctors had to be involved, re-evaluation, family members. So it's not, the point is, it's not just a simple fact of that. Finally, the argument from popular consent, or the democracy argument, whereby over the decades polls have indicated that to the question, when a person has a disease that cannot be cured, do you think doctors should be allowed to end the patient's life by some painless means if the patient and his family request it? So that's the question. That's the poll question. Public support has continued to increase. I think I mentioned in 1947, it was 37%. Recent polls, 75%. So this is the argument from democracy. This is what we as a people want. Okay, but thanks for coming out on this night. I appreciate it.